Boy, that's a common question, and one that's people have brought up all the time. Atlantis has been put all over the world, from small islands in the Mediterranean to actually Crete or Cyprus, even to Algeria and areas of the Sahara. France and England have been talked about as Atlantis, Cuba, the Caribbean, Mexico, even North America has been said to be Atlantis. And people have put Atlantis in places like Indonesia and spots like that. North Atlantic, around the Azores, of course, the Canary Islands. Part of the problem with Atlantis is that the story of Atlantis, as a famous one, is that there was a catastrophe. Also, Atlantis was an island. It's typically said, although a lot of people ignore that part, and so what people are looking for, they say, well, let's find an island and let's find a catastrophe, then maybe we'll find Atlantis. But that's part of the problem, is that there's so many catastrophes and so many islands and massive destruction and flood type scenarios that you can go almost anywhere in the world and find legends of that. So it's very easy to find legends of catastrophes, floods, destruction, but to place them all as Atlantis is one thing. There's been now that interesting talk about this, what they call the Eye of Africa. Have you heard about that? It's a kind of a meteor strike in northern Mauritania. And it's a very interesting photo that you can see, these satellite photos, but it makes a concentric crater. And that's one of the things they talk about Atlantis being, having concentric circles. So that's one of the more recent ideas out there, that this Eye of Africa is actually Atlantis. But it's out in the middle of the desert, of the Sahara Desert, that place.
I think the Azores is pretty compelling.
Yeah, in my book on Lost Cities of Atlantis, Europe, and the Mediterranean, I largely say that it's probably around the Azores. Geologists say that 12,000 years ago or so, ocean levels were 300 feet lower than they are today. And that was during the last ice age. So during the last ice age, there were these huge ice caps at the North Pole and even around Chicago and the Great Lakes, and in theory, a big ice cap at the South Pole too. But if you were to lower ocean levels by 300 feet, that would turn areas around the Azores into a mini continent, just like Atlantis. It would turn the Bahamas also into a mini continent. It would make the Caribbean and those areas also more of a larger, bigger island instead of a bunch of small ones. And if you went out into the Pacific, you'd have more of the same. Areas around Tahiti, the Tuamotus, even Hawaii and Tonga and places like that, you would suddenly have mini continents, not these island groups that we have today.
How long have people been looking for Atlantis?
Well, Atlantis is in the Bible. The oldest books in the world are about Atlantis. They say that more books have been written about Atlantis than any other subject, except for the Bible. So anytime you're talking about the antediluvian world, the worlds before our own, civilization that's prior to, say, 10,000 BC, you're really talking about Atlantis. And, we might as well give it a name. And that name is Atlantis, really. That civilization that's pre-10,000 years ago or so. But we get the story really from a Greek, we get it from Plato, the Greek philosopher, who tells the story of his uncle Solon, who went to Egypt. And the priests in Egypt tell Solon, who's a Greek statesman, they tell him, you Greeks don't even know your own history. Greece is a much older country than you even know. And then they tell him the story of Atlantis. And that's how we get the story of Atlantis. Egyptian priests telling Solon this long story about Atlantis and how Atlantis had wars with ancient Greece and the Mediterranean, that there were lots of elephants in Atlantis. There's all kinds of things. Graham Hancock suggested in one of his books that Antarctica was Atlantis. And a lot of people thought that that might be right. I personally don't think Antarctica is Atlantis. I think it's too far away from the
That's a
Mediterranean.
little far from Greece, huh?
Yeah, and I don't think there were a bunch of elephants there. I think that Atlantis was much closer to the Mediterranean, like the Azores. You also have in France and England and Ireland, you have all these legends of High Brazil, of the lost land of Is, and that's in France and Brittany, the lost land of Lyonesse, that's in Cornwall in England. So in all these Western European countries, you also have legends of a Western land that's gone now and is sunken beneath the ocean. And that's, of course, the story of Atlantis, as we know. And in fact, the Atlantic Ocean is basically named after Atlantis. And I found one time when I was in the Basque area of northern Spain and southern France there, the Basque language is so strange with all these X and otl sounds. And it's very similar to the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, where you get these Quetzalcoatl, Otl, Atlanta, Exakikakakl sounds. And when you listen to Basque people speak, or you listen to Nahuatl in Mexico, very similar languages. They sound almost the same. And they're strange languages too. They don't think there's any language that's related to Basque. It's like a unique language, they say. Although, and this is perhaps the language from Atlantis, ultimately, just with the Basque language.